Yes, and thank you everyone who's here listening and engaging for your time today. It is great to get this overview. Okay, so this next, it's slightly less than half of the presentation is going to be all focused on small area changes. So as I mentioned at the beginning, this is a separate application, so they'll have to be heard as two separate items at the hearing next Thursday. This one difference is that we did notify every property owner within that small area boundary, whether or not the change affected their property or not. And so that is, there's a whole new small area procedure process, and that's part of what's required for this to be processed as a quasi-judicial approval type. Along with notifying all those property owners, the notification had to include very specific information, but it had to also be very general. So we did get a lot of inquiries on that. So I forget the exact number. I'm thinking it's around 12,000 letters were sent out to every property owner in each small area. And we received in between 250 and 300 contacts. So we've been really busy responding to questions, and a lot of that involved kind of one-off research to figure out whether that rule applied to them, what zone they were in, and describing the changes and how that affected them. So it is a good requirement when small area rules are changing to require that notice. We were asked to explain the difference why the legislative action does not also require individual property owner notice. And I guess our main response to that, and this may come up at the hearing next week, is basically it logistically would be so challenging to notify every single property owner. I have no idea how many there are, but that's kind of the reason we treat certain matters as legislative, because they apply citywide. And so there wasn't notice of the original IDO adoption, individual property owner notice, and there isn't of this annual update. But I just wanted to kind of highlight the two differences between these requests. Diving right into the content, a lot of these small areas originated in sector plans or historic protection overlay plans. And the last kind of category is there was a whole section, not even a part of the zoning code, that was called airport zoning. And that required, that had all of the APO, the airport protection overlay rules in that section that was not even a part of the zoning code. So we've kind of consolidated all that into the zoning code. And what's really nice and convenient about that is that there's a map where you can kind of query a property and figure out if any of these special small area rules apply to your property or not. And then once you know if one or more does apply to your property, you can go to the IDO, and at the beginning there's two tables, table 1 and 2. It's an index of all the special rules that apply to that property. So table 1 has everything in order by the sections of the IDO. So the zones, the use standards, the development standards, the process. Table 2 is the same content, but kind of reorganized and in order alphabetically by small area. So if you know you are in a specific small area, table 2 might be the place that you want to look to see what special rules apply and what maybe restrictions or allowances you might have based off of being in that small area. So these are the 10 small area overlay protection zones that were notified, and we have amendments proposed to them. So, you know, just to reiterate, the point of these small areas is to protect special places, and generally the point is to kind of pull forward rules from the prior sector plans that were maybe not as clear as they could be when we went to implement them. Here's a map of all those special areas. On the west side, a lot of property owners, this was a lot of the notice. I think 10,000 property owners were within one or both of those overlays. So that's the Volcano Mesa, there's Northwest Mesa Escarpment Plan, and then Coors Boulevard. Those are the three on the west side. There's Rio Grande Boulevard, Los Duranes, Sawmill, downtown neighborhood area, the downtown center. It's really hard, you can't hardly see it, but underneath my cursor, there is the East Downtown Character Protection Overlay and Historic Protection Overlay. And then finally, the Nob Hill Highland Character Protection Overlay. And as we kind of alluded to earlier in the presentation, there's also the uptown changes to allow drive-throughs for restaurants. That is not an overlay zone, it's a center type. And so they're not entirely, it's a little bit apples and oranges, but I'll kind of explain that as I go through. And I'll be reviewing these like basically in order by small area. Starting with the downtown first. The first change is down here. This is the dimensional standard table that applies to downtown, and it applies to any other mixed use form-based zone that's mapped in the future. What this change would do is allow a 0-foot setback for any of the mixed use form-based zones if the rear of the lot line abuts a street or an alley. And so this tracks with the change from 2019 where we allowed a 0-foot setback for urban centers, Main Street, and premium transit areas. But in that analysis, the mixed use form-based zone is a little bit of an oddball, and so it was missed. And this kind of makes it consistent with that change that happened in last year's annual update. The next two changes for the downtown area, this first one, lot size, this is in a section called contextual standards. And so this is the one I described a little bit earlier. In a neighborhood, if all the lots are the same size, we don't want to encourage people to subdivide their lot and add a whole lot more small lots within that neighborhood pattern, or consolidate and make lots that are much bigger than the normal lot size. But we want, there's kind of a sweet spot, and that's generally between 75% smaller and 125% larger. And so in these areas, we want to add downtown to the list of urban center, Main Street, and premium transit areas where you can actually go smaller. And so this is allowing a little bit more flexibility for infill development. The next change down here is the downtown area under the 2025 sector plan had a parking exemption. So it's the only place in the entire city that requires no parking for any new use. And that was kind of a big move in 2000 to encourage more infill and more development, and like allow the downtown to develop as like a pretty intense downtown, basically the most intense development in the state. But what we realized in the analysis, there's kind of been this tension between downtown and surrounding neighborhoods. And so when the downtown sector plan was adopted, it kind of sucked in the fringe of the area from the downtown neighborhood and then the Reynolds neighborhood. And so the character of some of those blocks is pretty residential or small scale. And so they kind of transition to what we call areas of consistency. So what this change does is it, instead of giving the parking exemption for the entire downtown that matched the sector plan allowances, we're shrinking it to be the downtown center. And so the downtown center is a little bit smaller, and it excludes those kind of transitional areas. And so any new development in those areas would have to provide parking. And so this is kind of one way that we've heard concerns that at the fringe of downtown, there's a lot of on-street parking pressures, and and it really helps kind of transition out of that downtown intensity. And then, okay, so this is the final change for the downtown area. This is about rooftop signs. In 2018, when we first adopted the IDO, we allowed this new sign type, which is rooftop signs, and they're pretty limited, so that you can't do just a new billboard like you'll see on some rooftops, like in LA and other big cities. These signs are required to be like pretty transparent, so like you can see the individual letters, and so that was allowed in the East Downtown area. And what this proposal would do is to also allow it in the downtown center and within, I think, 330 feet of the downtown center. So here's kind of the standards: that the sign area has to be pretty open and transparent, and using channel letters, channel graphics, or open lighting elements, so that it's not just a billboard. Moving on to our next small area, this is the downtown neighborhood area, or DNA, as a lot of people who live there refer to it. There's two small changes here, and on the side of the screen, I've put a screenshot of the sector plan that these rules come from. And then you'll also notice a really tiny hyperlink at the bottom of a lot of these pages, and that if you click on it, it will open up the repealed sector plan, so that you can actually find that language in the context where it applies. But I've tried to put everything in the presentation. The first change would be adding back this requirement from the sector plan that requires a 5-foot setback for a garage if it fronts on an alley. And then on the flip side, on the front side of the lot, it's also, there was a requirement that your garage has to be set back from your main building front 5 feet, so that it adds a little more articulation and dimension to those houses and reflects kind of the more historic development forms and patterns in that area. So that was inadvertently left out of the IDO, and this change would add these two provisions pretty much verbatim back into our land use system. The next change, this is East Downtown. This is basically between the railroad tracks and I-25. It's the same change in the character protection overlay as is in the historic protection overlay. And what that changes is there was a little bit of confusion in how the rules were carried forward. And this change is essentially to clarify that if your garage, a parking structure, sorry, not garage, a parking structure is at your property line, then you can provide, as part of your parking structure wall, that would be the street edge. And so it was a little unclear when we read it. And so that changes to pull forward these two highlighted sections. And then here's the exact text that's the same for the historic protection overlay. It also added a little bit more of the language to really track this character protection, to have the same rules apply whether you're a historic protection overlay or a character protection overlay. And what's unique about this area is it's a little bit like teeth, or maybe like a jigsaw puzzle, where one property can be a historic protection and then the next property can be a character protection overlay. And the difference is basically whether or not there was a historic building on that property. But basically we want the whole area to develop in a pretty consistent and cohesive manner. This next change, this is in the Nob Hill Highland CPO. This is a very small and technical wordsmith change, but pretty important. It says that the facade design should be built to function as a storefront or urban residential building frontage type. The language right now just says a storefront or a residential facade. but we don't have a definition of what a residential facade is, and there's no standards that apply to that. But what we do have is an urban residential building frontage type. And so by making that change, this regulation tracks more cleanly with our defined terms. This next section is on Uptown. This is a, I'm kind of losing steam here, but I'm 98% sure this is a council amendment. And what this would do is to allow restaurants to have a drive-up or drive-through facility if they're within a quarter mile of the Interstate 40 right-of-way. And so the argument in favor of doing this is that areas that are very close to the highway are probably more auto-oriented, and that may be a more appropriate location to encourage drive-throughs and drive-ups. And the other important thing to note is that right now you can have a drive-up for a bank or a pharmacy, but not a restaurant. And so restaurants do tend to have a little bit, or probably quite a bit higher volume, and especially these days they're going to have more volume. And so that's why in the Uptown sector plan they were prohibited, and this proposed change would essentially allow that kind of exception if it's near I-40. Okay, our next area is Los Dragones. The first change what we have is here's a clip from the sector plan, and here's the IDO text showing that change. And what the first amendment would be is to add 2-family detached dwellings to this standard. And so the section is about front setbacks, and right now the way it's written, it only applies to single family. And so there's other regulations down here that apply to multifamily. And what we realized is there's a gap if you have a duplex. And so this standard would be revised to say if you have 5 or more single family or 2-family, you have to vary the front setback. So it's kind of caught this gap that was unintended. The second change, the sector plan had this taller buildings were allowed, kind of similar to in the Uptown area, that if you're very close to I-40, then you could have a taller building in the MXM zone. And it just said from I-40, and it wasn't clear. Some of our rules talk about you can have larger signs if you're near a through lane of I-40, and but then there's also the edge of the right-of-way, and it was unclear, and we kind of looked at what the purpose was, and we thought that it was more likely that the intent was to measure 450 feet north from the edge of the right-of-way instead of any through travel lane. So that's what this is clarifying, so that it's in the text and it's clear like what we would be measuring, and that will allow more consistent implementation of that rule. Okay, the next area is the Rio Grande Character Protection Overlay 11. This change would revise the setback standard to be more consistent with the corridor plan that was rescinded, and also make a little wordsmithing changes so that it's described in a similar way to the required Coors Boulevard setbacks. And in both of those plans, the intent is to require a larger front yard or a larger setback from Coors or Rio Grande Boulevard. And this sector plan was really careful to say, whatever side of your property touches the road, whether it's your front, your side, or your rear, that side has to have the larger setback. And so it's either 20 feet or 25 feet, depending on your zone. And so the way it was written and carried forward, it seems as if you would have to have a 20 or 25 foot setback on all sides of your lot. And so the RA properties are big, but you know, a 25 foot setback's just exponentially larger than any other zone, and that wasn't really the intent. So this revision would basically kind of make it a little bit more clear that whatever side of your property touches the main street, that's the site that is required to have the large setback. And then the second change, this is a little bit more minor and technical, but there was a rule that said that your parking can't be in between your building and the street. And so again, that's to make kind of more attractive streets, and then requiring the parking to be on the side or the rear of the lot. And so the sector plan said non-residential development. And when we went to a system of allowing a lot of mixed use zones, we realized that that rule needed to apply both to mixed use development and also to non-residential development. So this change kind of carries forward the intent of it applying to all rules that are not just a low density residential development. Sawmill Wells Park. There are a couple of changes to this one. And again, these changes are substantially to carry forward rules that were adopted in the sector plan. So the first one, this would strike the words on residential buildings, so that if it were like a multifamily residential building, the standard would apply. And what it's basically aiming to achieve is that larger buildings, that the massing is broken up into appear like as a collection of smaller buildings. And so every 35 feet, your building has to kind of change in form or shape somehow to have an articulation. And that's basically to maintain the character and scale of this part of town. And then the second change is kind of this, it's essentially the same intent, but this is applying only to street facing facades on buildings that are along Mountain Road. I think this first one might be applying to the residential buildings, and this one is buildings in mixed use and non-residential zone districts. The Coors Boulevard VPO. This I have to say is probably the biggest and the meatiest of all of the small area changes. So we will probably spend quite a bit of time on this. You can see all the red text is new this year. And this is what we've been working on as a result of the EPC case that you are all a part of. And we kind of realized the rules definitely need to be clarified and revised so that we're implementing like what the original Coors corridor sector plan intended. And the other thing to point out, in the packet and in this presentation, there's some blue text, and those are things that we noticed last year that needed to be changed, but in the middle, or like rather after the application, we got direction that the small area amendments needed to be processed quasi-judicially. So all of them were pulled from that first annual update. And so that's kind of why we have a lot this year, is because there were a lot of small changes that needed to be fixed. And in this case, they're shown in blue, but in the course of the past year, there were a lot of big changes in this VPO that also needed to be fixed. So essentially, the biggest one that we omitted was the ridgeline test. And so that's something that says, if you're looking towards the mountains, no portion of your building should cross above the ridgeline of the mountain. That was like one big thing that we definitely needed to clean up. Some of the other changes are a little bit more technical. The first one's showing that we want to protect views to the ridgeline from each viewpoint. And so this viewpoint idea was not in the Coors corridor plan, but we realized that was kind of the hinge to make all of these rules kind of be pulled together. And so if we look at this little diagram, it would be to put a little dot and make a new defined term for viewpoint. And so a viewpoint is essentially the way that the sector plan regulated it was if you are in the easternmost travel lane of Coors headed north, 4 feet above the elevation of Coors at that point, that's kind of like the person's view that you're protecting towards the mountains and to the bosque. So that's like where we're measuring everything from this location. So this one diagram needs to be revised, and it's showing the viewpoint kind of on the property line, and that's incorrect. The viewpoint is actually in the travel lane. And so, and at the elevation, of course, at that location. So that kind of clarifying that, and then also clarifying that the views are always these views that we're looking 45 degrees away from the road towards the mountains. That's kind of the key view that we're protecting. So that's what these, this first page of changes is clarifying. The second page, this is kind of getting into the technical regulations. This is right here. This is clarifying that first you look at your zone district to determine the building height, and it can't be any taller. Like if you guys are familiar with this like section about how tall a building can be, it can't be any taller than that zone allows, even if it meets that 2/3, 1/3 rule. These other changes kind of are pretty wordsmithing, but they're clarifying that you can be at least 16 feet tall for low density and at least 20 feet tall for other uses, and just kind of clarifying how that rule is applied. Over here in the structure bulk, what we're doing is we've added that that ridgeline test in that was accidentally omitted from the Coors Corridor Plan. The other thing that I think is going to be really helpful, and I hope you guys agree with this, or agree with me, each of these, there's the 3 tests of to kind of figure out how much development you can have, and they've been named here. So the first one's called structure height, and then in parentheses there's view plane, because the view plane is the test that you use to see if you meet this rule. The second one is structure bulk, and that test is looking at, here's the picture of the view frame, to see if you comply with that rule. And the third one is about building massing, and so that's the site layout, the way that you put your taller buildings to the back and your shorter buildings to the front. And so the site layout would be the test to see if you comply with this rule. And I didn't point this out, but this is the section that's connected with the structure height rule. And that's it for Coors. I'll study it hard so that I can answer all your detailed questions on this one next week. Okay, the next one, this is the Northwest Mesa VPO 2. So this change would add a new height limit sub area that's 660 feet beyond the current height overlay area. The first one, you're only allowed to build up to 18 feet in building height. And then this next area that continues on another approximate 2 blocks, you can go up to 30 feet. And then beyond that, you can go to the full height allowed by your zone. And so again, it's kind of trying like neighborhood edges, but on a larger scale to step down to lowest density next to the Petroglyph National Monument. The second change is that more landscaping is required, a minimum of 25% of the net lot if you have a multifamily, mixed use, or non-residential development. And I believe this came from Open Space Advisory Board, and this is one way of kind of allowing more permeable land to address drainage issues, and it's another way to kind of control what the overall density of a site can be by requiring more landscaping. So that's kind of a dual purpose amendment. The last one, there's these uses that are kind of auto-oriented and more industrial, and citywide we've kind of said that these uses should be either prohibited fully or only allowed through a conditional use process if you're really close to major public open space. And so what this rule says is also within the two height limit sub areas, which are the closest to the Petroglyph National Monument, those uses also are either prohibited or made conditional. So it's just adding these two areas to those existing use standards. Okay, the next two changes, these are pretty small and technical. The first one, this is looking at views that from below the escarpment, which is substantially developed but not entirely. But this is kind of like a test that says if you want a taller building, you have to show how you're mitigating the building heights impact on views of the escarpment. And so the way it's written right now, it says 2-story, and we want to change it to say any structure should try to mitigate views, not only just 2-story buildings. And then the second change, this is in the procedures section. And so this is if you want a taller building, one of the main reasons that we've seen people ask for taller buildings is because of drainage requirements, basically that the road elevation was set and the building pad is below. And so people want and actually are required to raise their building pads so they drain to the street instead of draining into the Petroglyph National Monument, which is not allowed. And so this is just kind of adding in the list of reasons that you can request this taller building, just being very clear and transparent, like drainage requirements is one of the reasons we know people have been requesting it. So this doesn't change the process or the regulation in any way. It just describes what we're seeing. Moving on to the next overlay, Volcano Mesa, CPO 13. I left this slide in because you may hear a lot about this. We certainly received a lot of comments. This is not in the application packet at all, but what the proposal would have been to allow cluster developments. If you did a cluster development anywhere in this character protection overlay, instead of being limited to 50% of your building footprint could have a second story, a cluster development would allow up to 75 of your building footprint to have a second story. So the trade-off would be more open space that are kind of like view corridors into the Petroglyph National Monument in exchange for kind of bulkier and massier buildings. And so that was a rule from Volcano Cliff Sector Plan. And it's actually only applied to the Volcano Cliffs large lot, which is basically just this area right here. And so in our neighborhood meetings that happened before the application, we got lots of comments about this and a lot of pushback. And so we researched it further, and council actually brought to our attention that it was just this one zone, and it was it was a request to see if we would be willing to expand it to all of the residential development in that area. And the planning department just basically saw that this scale and applicability, expanding it to all of this was more than what we intended to do with this technical change. And so we pulled it from the application. That's not to say someone from the public may still ask us to apply this, but there's probably going to be more people saying, please don't apply this because we really value our views. And a lot of people feel like that that could destroy some views. So that's why it was not submitted. The next change, there's a few on the slide. The first one, this change kind of clarifies about where you can access your garage, and for any corner lots that are undeveloped up in this character protection overlay, this rule says that it used to just say a side street, which was not clear. And that's what the IDO just pulled forward the sector plan language. And what we felt was more clear was to say from the side or rear lot line. And so a lot of streets, it's two local streets and you're on the corner. So how do you decide which is the side? And so you would decide which is the side by saying the street that you're either addressed from or your front lot faces, that's the front lot. And then the side lot is the other side, and your driveway has to come from that side. The second change is also related to the driveways and garages. And what this change is to say that if you have a 3-car garage, then your third garage, or your first, whichever way you look at it, one of your garage doors has to be set back 2 feet from the other two. And that's to build in more articulation in the building facade to kind of result in a more attractive development. And what we realized was if your 3-car garage, if the doors don't face the street, then there's nothing that's gained in terms of the physical streetscape by requiring one of the 3 to be set back further. So this rule just says any front access garage. And so there's a few changes to the definition that clarify what a front access or a side access or a rear access garage is, so that we're clear about what the requirements are, and that they're only required where they're going to help improve the neighborhood character. This is the last CPO that's changing in the last slide on it. Another thing that we realized that was left out from the Volcano Cliffs sector plan was a prohibition on electronic signs. And so we've added that back in, and it does apply to the entire character protection overlays. But we've received comments on this, and so that is the Volcano Cliffs area. So that's all of this. It never applied to the Volcano Heights area. And some of the comments we said or received said, this should probably not, this prohibition shouldn't apply to the Volcano Heights area. And so in the staff report, we're proposing a condition to say in that urban center, which is where we want like the highest and most intense use in on the west side, essentially, that this prohibition wouldn't apply. And so that's one change that I'm kind of signaling from the application that you'll see in the staff report.
So Ms. Barkhurst, quick question on that note, because you've made a number of references, and rightfully so, because if anyone's paying attention to these small area changes, meaning neighborhood associations and also developers, we're going to have a lot of commentary, and it sounds like you've heard a lot of commentary. So for our context, what we get presented with next week is going to, none of those commentary have been applied to what the applications we're going to see next week. We're going to see them as conditions or commentary in the staff report, correct? But my point is the commentary that you're referencing now is not going to be as part of the presentation, but they're going to be additional information, correct?
The one, yes, that's correct, except for this one.
Except for the one that's being withdrawn, right?
Yeah, this kind of massing one, we learned about it before the application happened, but other ones like this one, this will be a condition of approval.
Okay, so these will all be conditions. We'll go over those at the end, and those are taking into consideration current conversations that have happened up until this point, and obviously nothing that will happen next Thursday.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's a great clarification.
Thank you.
And with that, we are done with the citywide and the small area. And just kind of an overview. We're in the middle of the IDO, or at the beginning of the IDO annual update process. We've kind of had a few public meetings. We are starting our review process with you, the EPC. After that, it'll go to the Land Use Planning and Zoning Subcommittee, and then on to Council. So that's one way of getting the rules right. And we're still more in the mode of fixing fixing things that are not clear and pulling forward sector plan rules. But we anticipate soon we're going to be beginning the community planning area assessment process with the near heights. That's going to start in February. And we expect through these assessments, we might hear new things like new rules need to apply in new places or new protections need to be added. So in the next annual update, you might start seeing some of those. We're going to visit with the Near Heights CPA, the Southwest Mesa, and then the downtown CPA. So those are all going to happen this year. And then finally, another way of getting the rules right is if it's something big, it could come through council. And that's kind of another big way that if there's something we can't handle in-house, like council may need to hire someone the way that they used to hire planners to do sector plans. But we've essentially kind of taken that function over in-house, and the long range planning department has been doing that also. This last slide just has links to all of these resources. And as I said, the planning webpage with the staff reports will have all the attachments and the updates and the conditions and the findings and everything, all the amended exhibits. We'll also post those on the project webpage. And then here's a link to the comp plan. The staff report again has the policy analysis, but if you want to look yourself and remind yourself about that big picture context, there's that, and there's the interactive IDO, and then the zoning map. So with that, that concludes my presentation. I guess I'll turn it back over to you to see if there's any big picture clarifying questions or anything that I can help with before the hearing next week.
So before I go, thank you again. That was a great presentation and definitely a good starting point for preparing us for what we're going to hear, see, and listen to next week. Before I make an additional comment on that, does any of the commissioners, any of you guys have any questions in regards to what we just saw, Ms. Barkers?
Eister.
Commissioner Eister?
Thank you, Chair. Last year, the 2019 update, we probably had 4 or 5 hearings over 4 or 5 months, and the target kept changing every time. It was almost like we never would get ahead of the snowball, you know. How do you see that might happen on the 2020 update?
Is that well, and that's kind of what I was going to go into after. Let's talk about that in a second versus any questions on the actual presentation.
I'll just add, since I have the floor, I appreciate Ms. Barkhurst's work on this, and it was very helpful for me. Thank you.
Okay, so let's just clarify. Anybody else have any actual questions on the presentation itself?
Mr.
Okay. Commissioner Ollinger?
Were we emailed a copy of your report?
I am not up to speed on that. I don't know if Mr. Aranda is. I know that current planning is working on it, and I'm not sure the status, what's happened since we've been here in this meeting.
And just the last page that you presented with all those links seemed like it'd be really helpful just as a reference. So that would be nice to have.
Yeah,
I'll definitely work on a cover page with links to all of the latest information and make sure that you guys get that.
Well, Commissioner Ollinger, kind of per what we had talked about earlier, some of that information's been updated, so I don't think we want to put out too much, but I do think, as Ms. Barkers just said, having that cover sheet of the linkable stuff would be actually the best way.
Okay.
Any other questions on the information provided? Okay, so now to Commissioner Eister's commentary, and that's kind of what I was going to hit around too. Yeah, we drugged that on for 6 months, and and the reason is because number one, it was volume. My opinion, there was so much more volume that we had to go through, and also stakeholders, I believe, kept arriving late into the game. I would say people were unaware of the process
Right.
in the community about how they needed to be on the front end of this. And so every time there was a hearing, we'd have a new set of stakeholders that would appear and have their own additional commentary. So I think that will also help that everybody has been through this one time already. So I think we've got two good things working for us. I would expect that just like last time, this very first set of the hearing next week, the very first blush won't be our last blush. We're going to generate a whole new set of questions and commentary that'll have to get addressed by the city planning staff and say, okay, here's our recommendation. Yes, this can be a condition of approval. Yes, we agree to this. So I would expect that next week's meeting won't be the last one. And hopefully it won't be, as Commissioner Eister pointed out, 6 months later.
We're hopeful that that'll be the case also. Since,
I think we have, as I said, we've got two things working in our favor. Everyone's already done it once, and so they know now. Everyone knows now that they were thoroughly confused after 5 months and not understanding where the heck we ended up, and that they needed to be on the front end. So I'm assuming that we're going to have, it'll make next week longer, but longer will be better in the end result, I believe.
And we haven't so far received very much public comments on either of these, just kind of a smallish handful, and we think we can address most of those. Of course, we don't know who will show up at the hearing, but one of the things we want to be mindful of is that our long range section is starting a CPA at the beginning of February, and I'll be starting one at the beginning of March. And so having this multitasking is going to be pretty hard, and also doing the transmittal to council. So we, we'll of course look to you to see what we need to get through the review process, and feel like we've all done a thorough job on it. But at least my role may taper down if it goes beyond February.
Yeah. Planning to plan and planning to prepare are two different things. And I think that, I think that will, I think we're in a better starting point than we were last year. So I think that's awesome. And I think you guys have done a great job of documenting everything. We already started off with a spreadsheet that we didn't even start off with last year. We created that spreadsheet in the middle of our first meeting last year. So we're already in a better spot. So thank you, Ms. Parkhurst. Mr. Aranda, is there anything else that we need to deal with in this particular training session?
No, sir, Mr. Chair. I think you've hit all the high notes. I'm glad we've kind of had at least an initial conversation on getting this through. I think you definitely don't want to rush things through and not be transparent. You want the public and all stakeholders to have adequate access and information and ability to engage. But we also don't want to be late for next year's update due to this one as well. And so that was kind of why the time frame for this one was a little bit compressed, was last year's update really reached into this year. So I'm glad commissioners are cognizant of that and recognize that. Let's do the best job we can to ensure maximum engagement and transparency, but while also respecting and understanding that the process has to happen relatively quickly. So I appreciate your efforts today. You did a really great job facilitating. Carrie, great job on the training.
Thank you.
No.
All righty. Any other commentary or anything, or close up shop? Okay. Thank you guys for all attending, and we will see you bright and early next Thursday morning to begin the process.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate your time, folks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, great job, Carrie. That was a mouthful.
Bye. Thank you. I'm glad it was helpful for everyone.
Oh no, it was
Well
awesome.
done. Very well done.